Welcome to the Land Rover Above and Beyond series. I'm Jason Fox, and for the purpose of this episode, I'm going to be talking to you about my Yukon River expedition. I'm first going to start off with why and how I came up with this idea. I actually came up with it with a friend of mine called Sean. He's also an ex-Royal Marine who I served with many years ago. Sean has canoed a lot of rivers around the world. He's done the Mississippi, he's done the Missouri. He's very experienced with that, and I always wanted to go along with him as well as a friend. And years ago, we decided that we'd love to do the Yukon River, which starts in Yukon Territory, Canada, and it then flows all the way through that territory into Alaska and out into the Bering Sea. And so our journey, because we wanted to follow a journey, was going to be in the footsteps of the Klondike gold rushers, the stampeders. They're the people that back in the 1800s found out that gold existed in this part of the world, and they wanted to go out there and find their riches and make lots of money by mining for gold. One of the main threats to us on the entire journey wasn't so much the weather, which yes it was, the weather and the environment was, but for me, the biggest worry was bears. The place is teeming with black bear and brown bear, or otherwise known as grizzly, and it was something that was always lurking in the back of my mind. And so before we went out on that trek to Lake Bennett, you know, the 49 miles, we got briefed up by some rangers or some park wardens about what we needed to do and what we needed to carry in the event of a bear attack or an encounter with a bear. It was something that we always thought about. It was nothing that we encountered at the beginning part of this trip. And to be honest, the first 49 miles to Lake Bennett were very uneventful. It was great scenery. We passed from coastal subtropical rainforest up over the mountain pass at Chilkoot into Canada, where we started to encounter glaciers, and it was clear skies, amazing weather, and it was an unbelievable 49-mile walk. We had 3 days to do it, and that was because we had to meet the train at Bennett on the dot to pull our boats off of it. Otherwise, it would have left without us, and then that would have been the end of our journey. It took us about 2 hours to pack our kit, and then that was us. We were off onto Lake Bennett and away, starting the proper part of our journey, you know, paddling down the length of the Yukon River. We set off, the skies were blue, and within about half an hour, the skies went dark, the wind started to pick up, and that was our intro to the River Yukon. It was all lakes for the first 3 days. It was really, really hectic. The winds had whipped it up into an absolute frenzy, and we were struggling to stay in our boats. We then, at the very top of Lake Marsh, we then found the Yukon River. Now, it starts off actually quite slow. We were hoping for a bit of speed, a bit of flow with the river, but it was actually really slow, and we had to work hard to get through that beginning bit. We were stopping every night. We'd always do a bear check. We'd have to check for bear tracks wherever we stopped. We'd set up tent, and the routine for setting up our campsite was pull the boats up, get the food out, pitch tents a distance away from the boats. We'd have our food, and then what we needed to do was actually move away from where our tents were, put the food back into an airtight container or an airtight bag, and then we'd have to hoist it if we could into a tree. And that was basically to keep the bears, if they did become attracted by the smell of the food, away from us. So if they turned up, we could get out of the tents, move down to the boats, and then get away safely without getting any sort of undue, unwanted attention from the bears. We passed into Alaska from Canada, and we were expecting 2 huge flags, one Canadian, one American, denominating that we had crossed the border into the United States of America. There was nothing there. We had a great deal of difficulty trying to find this point on the map, or this point on the ground, that we could get out of the boats and sort of have a little bit of a celebration that we'd hit a massive milestone. We didn't. We actually found a very small silver obelisk deep in the undergrowth. We had to hack our way through it, and there we found the point that apparently said that we were now crossing from Canada into Alaska. The river was getting really windy by this stage. Moved through a place called Eagle, where we saw a few locals, but ultimately there wasn't that many people around to be seen. We really were in what is one of the last wildernesses on the planet. The journey from Eagle, where we checked in with US Customs, all the way up to what our next main marker was, a place called Fort Yukon, which is at the very northern tip, or it's as far north as the Yukon River goes, which is actually in the Arctic Circle. By this stage, it's July, it's very warm, and the river is really, really slow. The river now is meandering and weaving all over the place. It becomes very, very wide in places with lots of different islands in between and in the middle of it, lots of sandbars, and extremely slow, which actually got quite demoralising at this point. And to coincide with the slow river, that part of Alaska is known as the Yukon Flats. It's very flat. There's not a lot of topography. There's not a lot of hills, mountains around to look at to distract you from the boredom of the river. And the forest that is around there is on fire all the time. We didn't see the sun at this stage for a good 2 weeks. It was completely smogged out, and it took a very long time to get to Fort Yukon. So the Yukon Flats officially stops at a place called the Yukon Crossing. By this stage, we're a good 3 weeks into this trip. We're starting to feel the pain a little bit. We're sat in canoes for a good 14 hours a day, paddling away. Elbows are sore, backs are sore, and we needed a good 48 hours at Yukon Crossing just to sort of give ourselves that break before what was the final push, but still nearly 1,000 miles to go. Our next biggest worry was a place called the Devil's Elbow on the river, and it's a very, very sharp right-hand turn if you're going with the flow. Apparently, the weather can really whip it up into treacherous waters. There's talk of people dying there, and it was something that was really, really sort of in the back of our minds. We hit it at about 9 o'clock at night, and we had no idea what all the horror stories were about. It was absolutely plain sailing. And actually, when we got round the other side, me and Sean were actually high-fiving in the boats, telling each other we'd cracked it, that the river was done, the hardest part was in the bag, and we were plain sailing all the way down to the mouth as it opened up into the Bering Sea. Now, as we'd left a place called Mountain Village, that night on the sandbar, the weather had been, it was wet, very wet, and a lot of our kit had got wet. So the following morning, we had to pack our boats with wet kit and set off on the river. That day was actually, it turned out to be a really nice day. And in the morning, as we were paddling along, me and Sean said to ourselves, when we stop for lunch at the next sandbar, we'll get all the kit out, peg it out on the sand, and just dry it in the sun while we have our lunch break. So that's what we did. We stopped, pegged out all the kit, sat down and enjoyed a snack of, I think what our snack consisted of was crackers, ham and cheese, and we'd get a coffee on the go on the stove. Then what we'd normally do is we'd sort of pack all that away once we'd finished lunch, and we'd have a little bit of a siesta, a little bit of an afternoon kit before we cracked on with the rest of the day. On this occasion, I can remember waking up, and as I woke up, I'm starting to pack the kit away and I'm starting to stretch off, and Sean had gone up onto the top of the sandbar, like a small high point, just to survey the area. And it was at that point that I looked over at him that he turned around to me and shouted, "What is that? I think I can see something over in the distance." And he said, "It looks like a moose or a bear." And I was like, for the whole trip, he'd been talking about the fact that he'd seen a moose or a bear, and I'd never seen it. And I just thought I basically thought he was lying to me. Anyway, I decided to go over and see Sean on the high point of the sandbar. And as I got there, he actually bolted past me, running as fast as he could, screaming that it was a grizzly. I looked over into the far distance, to which I couldn't see anything. And then as he's clambering around trying to get into his boat, I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye, and literally about 50 foot away was a huge grizzly moving at speed towards us. I panicked, screamed, and started running towards the boat. Now, if you remember rightly, the advice that we were told was to stand tall, stand our ground, and front it out with a bear. That was not going to happen. This thing was massive. I eventually made it to the boat, sat in it backside first, and paddled out into the middle of the river. It was at that point that me and Sean were there. All our kit was still on the shore, and we basically had to sit it out. And there was a form of Mexican standoff while this bear sniffed around our equipment, pushed a few things here and there, realised that there was no food that it wanted to eat, and after about 10 minutes it sort of went over the other side of the sandbar brow and disappeared from sight. We were still very cautious. We gave it another half an hour while we were paddling around in circles in the river, and then we went back in, and very, very tentatively and very quickly gathered up the rest of the kit, stuffed it into the boats wherever we could, and then we moved off and paddled about another 2 miles down the way, found another sandbar, sorted the boats out properly, repacked it properly, packed up all the dry kit, and off we moved. And then we were on to pretty much the last leg. And so we set off on that last leg after about 3 kilometres. So we're only 12 kilometres from Imonak now. The wind started to pick up, and the river by this stage could at times be a good 4 miles wide. And when the wind picks up, it becomes a sea. And at this stage of the game, the wind was behind us, it was picking up fast. And the sea, the river itself, was becoming more than we could manage as canoeists. Sean made the call that we needed to pull over onto a sandbar and just camp it out, which is what we did. We pulled over, set up the tent, pulled the boats out of the river, and then battened down the hatches for a long night in the storm. And it really was a long night.
Imonak's 12k away, but the water's out there is like a sea state, so we just can't paddle in it.
It was pouring with rain, and it was absolutely miserable. We were soaking wet through, really uncomfortable, and we took turns every hour on the hour. We'd take turns peering out of the tent to make sure that everything was okay with the boats and all of our equipment that was outside.
Okay, you probably can't see a lot, but finally it gets dark on one of our last days, and it's now, I don't know if you can see there, but tent's collapsing down on us. Just can't sustain all this rain.
We didn't get much sleep that night, and we envisaged that we were going to be in Imonak, within a few hours. It wasn't to be the case. 5 o'clock the next morning, Sean has a look outside the tent, and all of a sudden he turns to me in a bit of a panic and says, "Mate, we need to get out of here now, collapse the tent and leave. The island, the sandbar we're on is flooding." We both panicked. I looked out of the tent, and sure enough, the river was creeping in on us, and it was nearly at the boats. We basically got out of the tent, packed it all down, packed it away in a mad rush, and then had to get and sit in the boats. Bearing in mind, the river was still this turbulent mess. It looked like a sea. And we were suddenly realising that the end of the river was going to be the sting in the tail of our entire trip. We moved off away from the flooding sandbar, and we were then in the middle of this turbulent storm. We were getting hit by waves from all directions, and we were absolutely petrified. I made the call that we needed to get across to the other side of the river, because that was the side that the village of Imonak was on, and that would then be our safe haven. However, because the river was so powerful and so strong, it was a real worry, and it took us about 2 hours to get across from one side to the other, all the while being absolutely petrified of capsizing, because in that sea state that the river was in, if we'd have capsized, we'd have been goners. We powered on, and with grit and determination, we got to the other side of the river. The river was still at this stage a turbulent mess of water, and we realised that we needed to get out of it. So again, we thought we were going to be in Imonak by this stage of the game. We weren't. We had to find somewhere suitable to pull the boats out on the other side of the river, and we went in and battened down the hatches again. By this stage, the tent had been ripped to shreds. It wasn't being held up properly by the poles because it had been battered by the storm the night before, and everything was becoming a little bit too real and worrying, and we were getting closer and closer to our flight out of Imonak.
So here we are, as you can see, completely flooded out.
The river is turbulent, to say the least. Big waves smashing around. It's like a big sea. It is a big sea, basically, and it's just not paddleable. We were caught in it yesterday, and it was probably the most scared me and Sean have ever been, minus animals.
It's not worth it, and as tempted as we are, it's just too dangerous, and we're freezing. I know you can't see that, but actually it is freezing, and if we capsize, that's game over, to be honest.
The only thing that got our morale up was actually I found a tube of Pringles buried in the deep dark recesses of my canoe, pulled it out, and that was actually the only thing that got ourselves out of a little bit of a dark pit. It was actually after we'd pinged open that tube of Pringles and we'd finished it that the storm just it disappeared. The winds died down, the cloud cover lifted a bit, and with that the river flattened out and became something manageable. So we got back in the boats, and we paddled the final 12 kilometres all the way into Emonak. That's us, Bering Sea, right in the mouth of the delta of the Yukon River. We've done the trip, that's 222,029 miles. And that was the end of the river. It was an emotional journey. It was tough. It was supposed to be tough. We were doing it for charities that support veterans, and those charities support them in time of need when they're having hard times. And so we were glad that the journey, the river, was tough and that it was hard, because ultimately we were doing it for people that were in a lot harder and tougher situations than we were when we were on that river. It was an amazing place to see, and I'm so glad I've seen one of the last wildernesses on the planet. And that draws to a conclusion my above and beyond adventure for Land Rover.